All right, so I didn't change my diagram very much. We're moving into kind of another fossil fuel. So here we've got natural gas, and one of the things that hopefully you noticed right off the bat is I didn't change much. I just changed where the coal was coming into the system, because fundamentally the power plant works the same, but it's essentially bringing in gas from a pipeline, which eliminates the need for a train and a storage yard and all this stuff affiliated with coal that adds cost. And we pipe that methane, that natural gas, into the boiler room or the furnace, and we have something similar to like your gas stove at home, right? Or you're like in a professional kitchen, right? A flame, a natural gas burning stove. And what that does is, surprise, it boils water, and all of the rest of the system works the same. So the biggest problem with this historically was that natural gas wasn't cheaper than coal, and cash rules everything around us, right? We all learned that in the early 90s. And we had a big change in our power structure, really, with what we call the natural gas revolution, or the fracking boom. We had kind of figured out these methods to extract natural gas in great volumes and fairly cheaply. And so actually the cost of natural gas has now made it cheaper to run a power plant on natural gas than it is with coal, because also you avoid all the problems. You don't have to store your coal ash, you don't have to truck it in. You can basically put in a pipeline and you just pay for the gas that you burn. One of the biggest benefits at the end of the day is that of the fossil fuels, natural gas produces the lowest amount of CO2 per kilowatt hour. And you can see in this diagram I'll pop up here, and it's volumes of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So transitioning to natural gas is, I always say it's kind of like quitting smoking and picking up vaping. Like, it's still, the underlying problem is still there, but it's probably way better, right? So one of the things that we'll explore kind of at the end of this module is that coal is really on its way out, right? So in this, in this class where a lot of things seem kind of doom and gloom, the reality is we burn a lot less coal than we did even 5 years ago. Again, despite what politicians say. Coal's pretty much dead. Big coal companies are going bankrupt every single year. But the thing that's killing coal is actually natural gas. It's not, policy and regulation and other renewables, which we're going to talk about. It is that to some degree, but the biggest hitter in what's really costing coal is natural gas. And part of the reason is it's not very expensive to take a coal-fired power plant and just reconfigure it to become a natural gas power plant, right? And so that's something that we see of kind of energy generation. There's a lot of coal slatted to go offline, and then when we look at new energy that's being added to the grid, it's a lot of it is renewables, but a lot of it is also natural gas, right? So that's kind of the shift. So again, we'll probably never get to like carbon free, or at least in the immediate future in the next little while, but we'll probably get to carbon better. Oil as a fossil fuel and its source of CO2 is a little bit different. So the two that we talked about before were primarily for generating electricity. Not exclusively for generating electricity, but oil is in a very limited instances used for electricity. Imagine going camping and someone's got a big Honda generator, right? You're burning oil to produce electricity. Some places, particularly far-flung places or places with really unreliable power, have basically giant generators that run on oil. That's a big part of how power is generated in Hawaii, because getting coal out there is expensive. There's no natural gas for them to exploit. Natural gas, it's hard to run a pipeline out to Hawaii. So a lot of their generated power actually comes from oil. Particularly also in developing nations like Africa, places that are just kind of coming online with electricity, oil oftentimes lends a big role because it's easy to bring in generators and it's easy to supply them with fuel, but it's expensive. So generally, when we look at global sources of energy, so you can see here, this is a diagram showing, overall energy over time. Oil's got a pretty big slice of the pie, but actually when we look at a similar diagram that's just electricity generation energy over time, oil has a much smaller piece of the pie because its usage is pretty limited. But we use it for transportation. So the difference between those two diagrams is essentially transport. And we rely pretty heavily on that, right? Ships use oil, trains use oil, trucks, cars, scooters, all sorts of different things, right? But what we're starting to see is this kind of general shift towards kind of electrifying our transportation, right? Obviously, everyone's seen a Tesla driving around town. 5 or 6 years ago, you didn't see that very often, or you kind of knew of someone that had seen one once or something, right? Now that they're becoming fairly commonplace, one of the biggest contributors is if we could figure out how to do big transportation that way. Although personal transportation is a pretty significant contributor, right? So, electrifying our transportation, well, it's one side of the story. The interesting thing about electrifying transportation is your transportation consumes whatever CO2 is actually back at the factory, right? So whatever Idaho Power is using, that's then applied to your transportation. Instead of your transportation being 100% fossil fuel, if you've moved into the EV, the electric vehicle space, you're just kind of, however the grid changes, your usage changes as well. And again, no surprise and very realistic, like we use less and less and less every year. Back in 2010, Idaho Power was probably close to 40% coal power. And now we're down, in the mid-teens to low teens, and we kind of see that trend continuing for a time. So as that power source changes, the electric vehicles kind of CO2 emissions change with it, because it is then just electricity. It's not the separate category of oil.